Hey everyone, so we're doing yet another episode in which I talk about issues related to public transport. Now, because normally I talk about public transport, I always talk about how other issues like housing or things like that are relevant to it. And this is going to be more about the concept of urbanism, and this is something that is not exactly transport, um, but I mean, transport is a predominantly urban thing. I've done this video already about how really when we're thinking about public transportation, we think about things in cities or connecting cities, and then the other things, let's call them regional rail um, lines. I want to call them things like Magdeburg to Leipzig, and I give that, or Magdeburg to Dessau, or things like that, and I give that specific example just because it's something that I was encountering when I was taking the free trains last summer. I haven't done this summer yet. Um, so those trains are not where ridership is. Like this line, yeah, it's nice to get from Magdeburg to Halle, but that's not the strength of the German rail network, and the German rail network has atypically little uh, urban emphasis, whereas let's say the French one, I think 60% of non-TGV rail ridership in France is in and around Paris. So we need to talk about cities, and this means we need to talk about who moves to cities, and that is something where we need to talk about the demographics of cities because uh, something that I've been noticing, and it's not just queers, it's other groups, is the overrepresentation of minorities in cities. Now, it's not every minority group. Generally, if you have I'm not sure what's the best term for this because if you say indigenous minority, people will think I'm talking about indigenous people in the United States who are atypically not urban for a group of people of color. It's also something that's true for minorities that, again, they might qualify as indigenous people by global definitions, but often don't. And the example I'm thinking in Israel is not Arabs. Arabs are they don't live in the same cities as Jews, but they're urban and urbanizing in around places like Nazareth. Nazareth's the biggest Arab city in Israel. I'm talking about people like a group like about like the Circassians. So these people. Um, so that is a minority group that exists in Israel. And essentially, they're in one specific part of the country. They're not especially urban. So, but these are people who have been in the country since before it was a country. They just got minority status. I don't even know what exact politics led to that. It's just a thing. Likewise, so for example, so these are examples, or or also in Germany, the Danes in Schleswig-Holstein, because the border region between Germany and Denmark was not neatly borders are never neatly ethnically divided, and because this is Western, not Eastern Europe, they did not do the Eastern European solution of ethnically cleansing everyone from one side to the border, or both sides of the border, as in Greece and Turkey. So, so these minorities are not going to be overrepresented in cities, but minorities that are descended from some kind of migration wave, or African Americans who I would not call descended from a migration wave because they came to the United States as slaves. They're not meaningfully immigrants or descendants of immigrants, African Americans, in the way that, let's say, Hispanic Americans are. Hispanic Americans, practically all of them, are either actual immigrants, voluntary immigrants who moved from a Latin American country to the United States, or descendants of such a migration wave. I think the vast majority are first, second, or third generation immigrants. There are a few who are not. They're again not very urban. Like New Mexico, I think, is a very large proportion of its population are Hispanics who were never immigrants. They did not come to the United States. The United States came to them. I conquered all of this part of Mexico in the Mexican-American War. But again, it's a very small proportion of Hispanic America. So Hispanics have these kind of immigrant dynamics. Black people don't, but within the United States, precisely because they've been there too long, not too long. Sorry, they've been there in the United States very long, and there was the Great Migration where they moved from being horrifically oppressed in the rural South to being horrifically but less horrifically oppressed in the northern industrial cities. So the same dynamics kind of apply. Uh, and the same dynamics apply for queer people. Queer people are pretty urban. Uh, so I only have American data on this. I think I saw a couple months ago something on Mastodon about the demographics of queer people in, I don't remember if all of the United Kingdom or just London. And uh, yeah, they were genocided. But the point is that is why Israel is why Israel gave them minority status, which I think it's the issue is that Israel likes giving special status to minority groups that are like that were not just vanilla Arabs, vanilla Arab Muslims. Um, and so anyway, the uh, so anyway, I saw something about about these demographics. I'm forgetting whether it was just London or all of England and Wales or all of the UK. The only thing that I remember from that is that the borough of London with the largest proportion of trans or trans and non-binary people is Barking, which was remarked upon because of the trans cat girl stereotype versus Barking. Um, so at least the demographics I can show you are going to be mostly American, and so it is. Let's see, by state, there's a percentage rank which I cannot tell what it actually stands for. Note that this is not the same as this. So if you do this, it's a little bit different, and I don't know why Maryland is, for example, number 28 here, whereas here it is the second. Again, there might be small variations. Mostly these seem to correlate, but not perfectly. Um, Now, so let me interpret this graph for you in a couple of ways. The first thing is that is more urban. So DC is number one. DC is also the number one by far in proportion of trans people. Uh, Most of the following states are also fairly urban. For example, Nevada. So Nevada doesn't have an urban reputation because it is a small state and it is in the West, and most of the state's territory uh, is middle of nowhere. However, I'm not asking for this. Does not query the number of trans people per square kilometer. This is or LGBT people per square kilometer. This is the proportion. In Nevada, in general, the Western United States is actually very urban. Um, uh, there's a little bit of a shade of Spain there, where Spain is not very dense, but so in Spain the way it works is that Spain has the highest weighted density of all European countries. Cities, there are cities, they're pretty dense, and then they just stop, and then the city ends, and beyond that there's nothing. Now, obviously, this is the United States, not Spain, so the density is much lower, but then the urban area ends and there's nothing. Um, as opposed to, let's say, the Midwest, where there's going to be farmland, and so the subdivisions might hop because maybe it was a little farming town that's become a suburb. Um, in Nevada specifically, it was always very fun looking at maps of congressional districts in Nevada because there would always be this weird thing where, like, maybe all of them are around Vegas, and maybe at this point the state is large enough that there's one entire congressional district that is not the Vegas region, and then the other three are parts of the Vegas metro area. So this is a pretty urban place, is my point. Now, it's not entirely just urban states because Vermont is rural. The other thing, it's also states that are very liberal. Vermont is sociologically white flight from New York by people who were politically rather left-wing. The most famous participants in that white flight are Bernie Sanders and I don't remember their last names, but Ben and Jerry. These were left-wing, all three of them, left-wing New York Jews who left for Vermont in the 60s. It was not considered racist to leave for Vermont, and I mean, Bernie, you can see what he did in Vermont in Vermont politics were actually good things. And so the point is that queer people move to where there isn't threat. So one of the things that is not very obvious with when straight people or people who just don't know enough queer people talk about queer politics is how existential it is. You see this to some extent in minority politics. It's maybe become more relevant in black politics in the United States in the wake of Black Lives Matter. Because before, I mean, so Black Lives Matter begins 2014. And there are shades of that a little early with let's say, Trayvon Martin, but in the 2000s and early 2010s, if you were to ask most politically aware Americans, what is black civil rights politics today, not the history of 1950s, 60s, 70s civil rights, but what would you talk about for civil rights politics in America today? And today, let's say it's 2005, 2010, maybe even 2013. They're mostly going to mention economic things. They're going to mention things like that black people are poorer on average than white people. They're going to talk about job discrimination, housing discrimination. They're going to talk about school segregation, big thing. Police brutality would probably be also on the list, but it would not be at the top of the list. And then after 2014, this changes. So it's again more existential politics, like, oh my God, we're under threat, people are killing us. And queer politics has always been like that. Which is not to say that there's not been economic issues with discrimination. There are. Issues of segregation, they're not really a thing. I mean, yeah, there's something called a gayborhood, which we're going to talk about in a bit because it is kind of an urbanist thing, but I'm also going to shit on this because the gayborhood is... I mean, clearly, I mean, obviously, neighborhoods like the Castro in San Francisco, they exist, right? So the Castro exists. The Village in New York or Chelsea. And I mean the New York Chelsea. I don't actually know if the London Chelsea is like that. Like, these are things that exist, but there was never that kind of segregation where in the New York of the 1920s, if you were black, you lived in Harlem. Now, this was a little, now to be fair, this was a little bit flexible because the rule in the 1920s was the definition of Harlem was racial. Wherever black people lived in Upper Manhattan, that was called Harlem. So a neighborhood that originally referred to this area, the term got kind of displaced. I mean, this is still Harlem, but the kind of center of Harlem moved to what is now just called Harlem on Google Earth and on East Harlem because, again, the definition was wherever black people live in Upper Manhattan is called Harlem. But there are parts of the city that are not Upper Manhattan. They kind of did not have black people. I mean, they did over time. So in the 30s, that's when Bed-Stuy became black, and that's when so Eastern Brooklyn is a big thing right now. So starting from Bed-Stuy and moving east, but that kind of total segregation of black people in the United States just never happened with LGBTQ people, which I mean, people who see me on the street do not know that I'm queer, usually. I mean, there are people who can guess, but I mean, these are usually people, but I mean, it's people who are going to have a lot of false positives too. So it's not really about that kind of segregation or about any kind of persistent poverty. Which again, that exists, but it's much more existential, and the consequence is much more existential. It's really about where there's physical safety, and that is where you're seeing queer people in the United States move to places like Massachusetts, Vermont, Washington. It's kind of telling how few places that are right wing there are among the top ones. I mean, there's Florida right now, But remember, this is from 2015, 2016. Um, Florida was not the locus of anything especially conservative in the mid 2010s. The perception was that it is a swing state. It has very conservative parts like North Florida, very liberal parts like Miami, and the more urban parts of Central Florida. So scroll down to locality in metro area. Like one of the like Orlando and Tampa are pretty high up there. And this is 2021. So so certainly in the mid 2010s, like Florida would not have been perceived as a very threatening place. Whereas I mean, for example, Austin is very high. So Austin is a very liberal place in a very conservative area. I met trans people who told me that they're not even that they're too afraid to even visit Austin, let alone the rest of Texas. I think Texas was an early adopter of bathroom laws, or of, let's call it bathroom politics, because in the United States is not meaningfully a nation of laws when it comes to social policy. It's a nation of what a politically appointed or elected, so same thing, prosecutor thinks will make their career, and all of this matters. So, and again, these are people who move to places. It's not. I mean, there's enough mobility in the United States that this was just which places queers move to. So part of it is this issue of safety, and the other is urbanity. And again, part of it is the whole safety in numbers issue. If you're a minority, you want to go to a place where there is some kind of safety in numbers, and this does not mean having to live in a ghettoized area. This is what I'm talking about, the gayborhood. So gayborhoods clearly exist. But they exist as cultural centers more than places where one necessarily lives. And this is really important also for the kind of politics of these neighborhoods, because what does it mean, cultural things? Like, I mean, in Berlin at this point, it's hard to say that there's a specific gayborhood, because first of all, it's the 2010s, or not even 2010s, it's the 2020s. Berlin is a rather pro-LGBTQ place, to the point that the mayor of Berlin, who is CDU, did not spend the most recent election campaign running on homophobia. They were running on more parking spots for cars, and on reopening a specific stretch of street in a specific neighborhood in Mitte to cars. It had been closed to cars before, and the businesses complained. But the previous election, 2 years ago, they were running on casual homophobia. The mayor's speaking at Pride today. Like, today is Berlin Pride. That's why I'm talking about this. And yeah, there was a lot of criticism of how dare they allow a mayor from a homophobic party to speak. But the point is that in Berlin, the mayor wishes to be seen speaking to Pride. I doubt Markus Söder, for example, or Friedrich Merz would want to do that. So the point is that in Berlin, it's hard, at this point, it's hard to say what the gayborhoods are. I mean, the queer community things that I go to tend to be all over, where all over specifically is defined as within or just outside the ring, but the eastern half of that region. So I think maybe Schöneberg is the westernmost outpost. It's never going to be in the most commercial part of Mitte. So let's call it this arc roughly. So again, it's not quite the east-west boundary of the city. For people who don't know where the boundary was, Kreuzberg and Neukölln were west Berlin, where they were the eastern outposts of West Berlin. To the north, this was Gesundbrunnen, Wedding. So it's places that are a bit like that. The issue is that part of the history is that LGBTQ. So I may be celebrating LGBTQ history in Berlin, but I mean, this is the 2020s. Um, the kind of let's call it joint queer history of the U.S. and Western Europe is that queer people, nobody wants to actually associate with. I'm not going to say queer. I'm going to say gay person for like the 60s, 70s. The term queer at the time is a slur. It only gets reclaimed in the 90s. And people aren't really aware of the existence of bi or trans people until later. So so gays. So it's mostly more. So I think it's the stereotype would mostly have been about gay men, but lesbians were always part of that. Is that they tend to move to places that are not very desirable, or they're not perceived as very desirable. So often this gets, so often it's like first wave gentrification, because it's places that are again don't have very good job access, and if you don't get paid very much because most jobs, as soon as they suspect something is gay about you, they will just fire you on the spot. None of them, they won't hire you because no, I mean, being gay was a fire on the spot offense in, let's say, 1970s America or Germany or so on. And so so now it was never moving to genuinely poor places. And this is the thing that is important to talk about. Like the village. So in the village, it was not the first. The gays were not the first wave gentrifiers. The first wave was Jane Jacobs. It became a gay neighborhood in the '60s. So that's already after the neighborhood was shown to be sufficiently rich and powerful to be able to beat the Lower Manhattan Expressway. So this is for people who really don't know New York highway history. Holland Tunnel, Williamsburg Bridge, Manhattan Bridge. There were plans to build a freeway connecting all of that. The neighborhood revolted. This was kind of the beginning of American freeway revolts, but it was the most famous one. And there was the whole, our neighborhood is so beset by downtown forces. This was already a rather, I'm not going to say wealthy, but middle class neighborhood. It was literally the first place in America, possibly the world, that gentrified. So people did not recognize what was happening. So the older people at the time thought this was a slum, and it wasn't. So this becomes a neighborhood, again, well on its way to gentrification. I don't know the history of the Castro as well. In Berlin, it's different. In Berlin, it's neighborhoods that are rather poor, often ones that are divided by the wall. So obviously not going to be in the east because queer culture, as we know it, didn't really exist under communism. Were there LGBTQ people in the Eastern Bloc? Yeah, but queer culture, as we know it, does not come from that. And so it was places like Neukölln, and as I said, it requires, because there's a lot of existential politics and a lot of issues of threat, these are places that also must have a tradition of being usually rather left-wing, or at least a specific kind of liberal. And Neukölln was the headquarters of the Communist Party of Germany in the 1920s and early 30s. Because at the time it was a poor working class neighborhood, and that's where the communists located themselves. The term Antifa comes from right here. So this is where you're seeing all the queer community spaces that are in Neukölln. And of course, then they spread out. This is so Neukölln, and again Kreuzberg, which was, I don't think was ever as poor. Then the wall falls. They spill over to places like Friedrichshain. Same things in Prenzlauer Berg. Schöneberg. I don't. Maybe Schöneberg also had a neighborhood. Early on, I don't know. My perception of Berlin 2020 is that the center is. It's a bunch of centers, but probably the highest density might be around Kreuzberg. But maybe I'm thinking too much about Südblock. Which is at quality. So the point is, I'm mentioning things that are about socialization, its community spaces, which means often in Berlin, it would often just be a bar that if you were just randomly there at a random time, you might not even notice it's different from any other bar, except for having a lot of left wing stickers, and having left wing stickers by itself does not denote that. It denotes something about the clientele, but it's something that I've seen in places that are very bourgeois. Like no human being is illegal. Now imagine stickers like that covering an entire door. And or one of the things you can tell is gender neutral bathrooms. It's not something you're supposed to do in Germany. You're supposed to gender the bathrooms. So in places where there clearly are two bathrooms and they're not gendered, probably denote something. And so it's much more. So it's very small business oriented. And this was also true in New York and San Francisco, and where it's a lot of it is, for example, the institution of the gay bar, or the gay club, and again, so because it's about, I mean, obviously people work at the gay bar, but most of the people who go to the gay bar are not working, and the upshot is that is that a lot of consumer theory, a lot of consumer urbanism, consumption theoretic urbanism is something that often is directly about gay people, about LGBTQ people, because often there's the consumption theory model of gentrification. Hey, Kaleidosin. So in gentrification, so the correct way to view gentrification, by the way, is production theory, which is that gentrification occurs when not enough housing is built, and then the question is which neighborhoods gentrify? It's the ones that have the most access to jobs. So gentrification, as we know it, where does it begin? It begins in the village. Now the village always had access to jobs because it was close to Lower Manhattan, but it was had a lot of industrial development. The industrial development left because of trucks. So the invention of the automobile in the late 19th century then leads to mass motorization with the Ford assembly line, and that also leads to mass trucking, and that changes freight logistics entirely, because previously the only way you're shipping your factory's goods, the only ways, not way, are by boat of some kind and by train, which means that you need to build your factory close to the waterfront or close to a railhead. You're not actually going to have that much. You're not going to have a train to every factory in the city. That's ridiculous. So the factories had to cluster, for example, near waterfronts and near railheads. And as soon as the truck is invented, the radius from either of these increases enough that factories don't need to be here, for example. And so they move to cheaper land. And then likewise, the subway also means that people can just move elsewhere and they don't need to walk to work anymore. London has kind of a similar history. I don't think the underground was as relevant, but so the neighborhood, not the first neighborhood that had gentrification, which is the village. The first one that had that named gentrification is Islington, and it's kind of the same here. I mean, there were a lot of railways here. These were mostly intercity railways at the dawn of the rail age in the United Kingdom. I shouldn't say the United Kingdom because it's Britain, because Northern Ireland wasn't like this, but Scotland was. So Britain and not England. So the railways were intended for passengers, because in the 1830s, 40s, 50s, passengers were the main source of revenue, but over time there was a shift to freight. But they also were used for freight. So on this map of London railways, so this is King's Cross to the East Coast Main Line, so that's where you get on a train from to York, to Leeds, York, Edinburgh, Midlands, which is stuff in the middle, it's East Midlands, things like Nottingham and Derby, Leicester, Sheffield, which I guess is Yorkshire, but it's on the same line. And this is St. Pancras, and this is Euston, so West Coast Main Line. That's by far the busiest. That's where you get a train to Birmingham, Manchester, Liverpool, and Glasgow. And the thing is, this is not how this would have looked even 70 years ago, let alone 150 years ago. I'm going to see if Google Earth is going to show me any history. Yeah, okay. Let's see what we can get from 1945. So first of all, with 1945, you can tell, for example, what is now Canary Wharf was a dock. It was a working industrial waterfront. So obviously they're not going to have. Also they're just not going to have. So, and I think even this is like after they removed some things from it. So obviously that's not going to be office towers in the 1940s because it's still docks. And here, can you tell that there's just way more rail yard infrastructure here, around here? Because these were the goods yards, because the trains were also used to deliver coal to London for heating. So a bunch of rail yards, and today that's not a bunch of rail yards. So they redeveloped the rail yards, and this area had good access to jobs. The working class didn't need to live here anymore. They moved to Essex. They generally viewed the move to Essex as a move up in life. And in the mix, middle class people came. And again, it's all about access to jobs. So this is how you should be thinking about it, which is production theory. And then things build themselves out of, again, access to jobs, mostly. Consumption theory is instead a theory where it's all about people moving to the city for consumption reasons, where what there is being consumed is not something in the city, but the city itself or the neighborhood itself. So consumption theory is that a neighborhood is poor, and therefore it has very poor people in it. And this does not have to be for a specific reason. This can be self-perpetuating. So the example again would be Neukölln. Neukölln being, again, a very poor area from when it was first urbanized, to the point that even the name Neukölln is a euphemism. It used to be called Wixdorf. Neukölln was kind of was a failed attempt at a rebrand. And this was reinforced by the wall, because this meant that the job access to Mitte was no longer there, is what I would say. The consumption theorists would ignore that. And so what I would tell you is that Neukölln has rising rents and Kreuzberg has rising rents because the end of the wall means that these are more central neighborhoods now. And so the consumption theory is that as poor neighborhood attracts people with not a lot of income, and this in particular includes artists and creatives, and this specifically includes queer people. Now, in the United States, there's also the issue of schools. The idea is that queer people very rarely have children. Today, it's more likely, but certainly in the 70s, in the 80s, wasn't much of a thing. Like gay adoption, kind of the next generation of gay rights activism, relative to that, and so people like that, so people with more cultural with not a lot of money, so they live in very poor neighborhoods, but more cultural capital, kind of kosherize the neighborhoods for successive waves. So essentially, I think it's a 3-wave model. You can break it down. Where the first wave is, again, starving artists. Second wave is non-starving artists, so people who have money, not a lot of money, but some money, work in creative industries, writers, editors. I mean, not writers who send an article to a magazine once a year. Right? I mean, or maybe if they're like that, then they're super elite types, and that's different. But I mean, like writers who earn money from writing, things like that, go to the cultural events that the first wave produces, They make their own cultural events, and then third wave, who have normal middle class money, like lawyers, come into the second wave events, and that pushes out the first wave, and then they move elsewhere, and the process repeats itself. This is a very common theory of gentrification. Again, it's something that is very easy to believe in if you're deep into issues of queer activism, especially the more radical kind. It's also completely bullshit. It is also complete bullshit. Uh, there are lots of places that are full of poor people, and somehow they don't gentrify if they are far from jobs. It's not about the cultural events. One of the things. Because I'm not very steeped in like first wave cultural events. I'm aware that they exist, but I'm not very steeped in them. But I'm aware of second and third wave, and the third wave people don't know the second wave people exist. Like the people that I play board games with, so the board games would be third wave because it's English speakers, very tech oriented. Like they don't know about second wave places like Lovelight or Belag. So Lovelight is one of these places that is, I don't know, around here, around Ostkreuz. Belaga is around here somewhere. It's actually remarkable how, if you actually know the second and third wave, how completely wrong that consumption theory is. And again, it's something that would appeal to like a story where maybe the gays are transforming the city for the good, or maybe later not for the good. And again, that's just not true. But what is true is that you can visibly notice how there are changes in the nature of businesses. So this is something where if you look at not where people work, but where businesses, where it's much more who consumes them than who works there are. And there you can see the aspects of consumption theory. So when I say businesses about consumption versus production, is that there are businesses that are, let's call them, production oriented. So what I mean is this is a place where most likely if you're going there, it's to work. So a factory is such a business. There are practically no tourists at your average factory, right? If you're going to a factory where, let's say, people make cars or something, either you're working there, or maybe you're doing or maybe you're part of the supply chain. Let's say this is a car factory. If it's a car factory, then someone who, let's say, drives a truck where you load a bunch of cars onto the truck to move them, that is someone who goes there, who doesn't work at the factory, but it's still going there for work. Another such kind of business is the office tower. Most office towers are largely work-oriented. Now, generally, office towers will also have retail on the ground floor, and this might be consumption-oriented, but usually if there's retail on the ground floor, it's often, let's say, a cafe or maybe some kind of cafeteria for office workers from the building. And if you have something, okay, maybe if it's a cafeteria for office workers, it would be internal. But usually if there's, let's say, a restaurant at the bottom of an average high-rise office tower, they expect that it's the clientele of the office tower or nearby office tower. So it's not maybe the exact tower, but let's say in a cluster of 12 towers or something, probably a restaurant there is intending to serve the people at these towers. And this is one of the remarkable things about, let's say, Lower Manhattan, is until very recently, there weren't really high-end dinner restaurants there, because Lower Manhattan is still, certainly was traditionally, but to a large extent still is, a single-use office district. A little bit of historic things or tourist things. So obviously, if it's a very famous skyscraper, then you will also get tourists, like the Twin Towers when they existed, World Trade Center for the Memorial, the Empire State Building. But for the most part, these are not very famous skyscrapers. if you go there, if you go in one of them, it's because, again, most likely you work there or you have business there. So this is a very work-oriented place. A hospital, I mean, obviously you might be a patient and that's not work. A university, if you, for a lot of commute reasons, you need to treat students as workers. Even if for some university finance reasons, you might want to treat them as customers. So universities are also going to be very, let's call them production oriented. And then there are places that are, let's call them balanced. So again, the hospital, because lots of workers, but also lots of patients. Airports, shopping malls, because these are very labor intensive things, but also they serve customers, right? I mean, if you go to the airport, you are either flying or are servicing people who fly. So it's either consumption or production. And a mall is the same thing. Retail is the retail business is very labor intensive. And so if you go to so if you go to a shopping mall, that would be a balanced place. But usually smaller kinds of retail are more consumption oriented. So if you go to a gay club, for example, then it's much more likely that you're going there as a consumer than as a producer. And there's a thing about queer culture where the kind of loci that define queer culture tend to be these kind of consumption-oriented places. Again, the gay club is a huge thing. Now, the gay club might not be as gay anymore. So Berlin is very famous for the clubbing scenes. Not scenes. I mean, probably it's big enough there are multiple scenes. I would not know, but I think Kit Kat began as a gay club before becoming more mainstream and straighter. And so a lot of the kind of wave patterns of gentrification you can kind of tell just by consumption-oriented things, like who goes to various clubs. So like originally, so usually it would start with very marginal communities, and then the communities themselves might get less marginal, which has happened with LGBTQ, which I shouldn't say has happened with LGBTQ people, because that is a little too clever. Has happened largely completely in large progressive cities with LGBT people, and is happening much more slowly with trans and NB people. So often, and this is also one of the things about gentrification, is that gentrification, one of the things that might cause it is that the community itself becomes wealthier. It's not displacement, it's the community becoming wealthier. As I said, the people who left Islington for outer London or for not even in London, they were working class people who viewed the council housing that they were getting, or wherever they were moving for was not council housing, as better than what they lived in before. In the United States, the neighborhoods that are identified with early gentrification, and this is ethnic, not a queer pattern, are white ethnic neighborhoods where the gentrification coincided with the assimilation of these ethnic communities. So the Upper West Side was not at all viewed as a middle-class neighborhood in the 50s and 60s. Now, this was a very Jewish area, and the Jewish community in the 1950s is still facing a lot of anti-Semitism. The assimilation of Jewish America to white America is something that takes place over the 50s and 60s. In the 30s and 40s, the Jews, yeah, they're legally white, but they're just about the least white legal whites out there. So as the Jewish community assimilates and gets wealthier in the process, the neighborhood itself, I mean, I won't say it's the same Jews, but it's often not the same Jews, because in the let's say 30s, 40s, early 50s, there are still Jewish ghettos, or let's say Polish ghettos, that would be Greenpoint in Williamsburg, or Greek ghetto in Astoria. And then as all of these communities just become normie white Americans, what happens is they do population exchanges with where normie white Americans live. So lots of people move out and generally perceive their lives to have improved. Lots of people move in, people who are often not members of these communities. And at this point, there's no stigma associated to living near a Greek or a Pole or a Jew. And so they perceive their life as having improved. Let's say they're moving to the big city for work and they found this really cool neighborhood, which is right across from Manhattan on the L. That would be Greenpoint, Williamsburg, in very early gentrification. But the thing is, the ethnic businesses are the ones that are going to struggle because they are the ones that are last to assimilate, because often if you're in a Greek neighborhood and you're trying to open, let's say, a supermarket, you would try to specialize in goods that the Greek community wants, because that's how you compete, because people who live in the neighborhood don't work there, so they or rarely work there, so if they want a normie American supermarket, they can do their shopping in Manhattan while they work or after work. So it's specifically the very community-oriented businesses that are the ones that complain the most. And this gets us to LGBTQ urbanism, because often it's the gay clubs that some of them manage to ride the wave, and again, like Kit Kat, have an audience that's not exclusively queer, but the ones that are or maybe sex stores. I don't know. I will not be able to to go into a sex store and tell you, oh yeah, this is definitely a place for lesbians, or this is definitely a place for gay men. But so the business either broaden their reach in this case, or they die. And the ones that have very radical and separatist views are usually the ones that are the loudest anti-gentrification and radical voices. They're the ones that can't really deal with this kind of integration, and so this is why I said at the beginning I'm going to shit on the concept of the neighborhood, because the neighborhood is a bunch of consumer businesses in one place. It's never been a kind of ghetto. So this is a really important distinction I think needs to be made. But the thing is, even if the pattern within cities is diffusing, it's diffusion, diffusing, D-I-F-F, not D-E-F. So the issues about concentration in large cities, these remain. Some of that, again, some of it is because the gradient in gay rights, not legal gay rights, but in can you walk on the street holding hands to a man or to women without someone harassing you. I don't actually know whether the urban gradient on this is decreasing. The gradient could be increasing, could be decreasing, but it's unclear. There are places where the gradient is very large. Like I've heard horror stories about Poland where in Warsaw it's fine. In Warszawa, two men can hold hands and it's okay. I imagine also in some of the secondary cities, but I was asking specifically about Warszawa. But in a bunch of, not even just rural parts of rural Poland, I was told this about some industrial cities where some mining towns, you do that, I mean, people will beat you up. And the cops are the cops. So, or that it's not, or that I've heard it's not safe for two women to hold hands on a train in Poland, on like an intercity train in Poland, or a regional train. Hungary, same thing. I mean, Hungary is very infamous for this, but apparently there it's safe in Budapest. Just don't go out of Budapest. And again, Germany is not Poland. I imagine it might not be safe in a place like Sonneberg. Sonneberg being the little county in Thuringia that voted for an AfD county executive. It's so unimportant I would not be able to find it on a map. I think it's here. But now let's see if I'm correct on this. Sonneberg. Yep. Yeah, it is in Thuringia, but on the Bavarian side of the mountains. Very peripheral. It's the people who most of the people who vote for Nazis are the sort of people who are like the more are these like often like workers or business owners and like very peripheral places that are mostly mad that other people don't want to get abused by them. So it's like the father whose queer kid fled to the city and instead of being able to beat the kid, the father just votes after. That's that's who the reactionaries are. They call themselves the left behind. It's not exactly the left behind. It's specifically the people that are left behind by people who are fleeing them. And so yeah, I don't think it's safe in Zonneberg, but why the fuck would I ever be in Zonneberg? Whereas yeah, I could see myself visit a part of Poland that's not Warszawa. I mean, we need to look in advance how safe it is, but I mean, it's a place, but in Poland, I suspect might be places that I would need to look this up for specific places I might want to visit. Whereas in Germany, I mean, the first time I heard of Sonneberg was when the election results were announced. This is not like a part of Bavaria that I would have heard of, or Thuringia or Saxony, and so again, but that's a question of level, and again, I don't know what the trend is about threat in cities versus not in cities. There is a thing right now where the fourth generation extreme right in Europe and in the United States is very explicitly homophobic in ways that it wasn't before. So third gen extreme right would be things like Trump, Le Pen, various, I think, Pim Fortuyn and Wilders in the Netherlands, Lega. So these are people who are homophobic, don't get me wrong, but I mean, they were not running on how much I hate gays. In some cases, like in the Netherlands, they even say, oh, I like the gays. I think Fortuyn was gay. And I so like the gays that I will tell you that all homophobia in our country is the fault of Muslim immigrants. So let's deport all of the Muslims. It's people who are very single issue anti-immigration, and were trying to get working class support. And they got some working class support, and then didn't get, and they were so repulsive nobody wanted to vote for them. Fourth gen is very recent, like the last couple of years, and they realized that the only immigration thing doesn't actually win elections. And again, Trump won, but I mean, then lost. And the Republicans are moving to other things in the United States. So this would be general hatred, often against Green voters. This we're seeing Hang the Greens posters in Germany, but also a lot of homophobia to the point that AfD literally put out a poster in Thuringia with the inverted triangles from with the inverted triangle that the equivalent of the yellow star that gays were required to wear in Nazi Germany. And said and told people that it's illegal now to use gender inclusive language in universities or some shit in Thuringia. I think they passed a law on state communications with Sado. So in German, so because German is a gendered language, a word by default is male. So like the word, driver would be male driver. So you need to put an N at the end, Farin, to turn that into a woman. So a lot of job ads and a lot of in general language would have a way to say this and the female equivalent, and this looks really weird to trans people. So in Thuringia actually, AfD and CDU collaborated on banning that in government communications, and now AfD is running against that. In Italy, the fourth gen would be Fratelli and Meloni, who recently just started stripping same-sex couples of cross-adoption rights. I think what happened was if a same-sex couple has a kid, then the same-sex partner of, I think, the biological parent would not would get stripped from the birth certificate. So a lot of anti-gay animus that is very recent. Again, I don't know how successful they are, but they so that might sharpen the gradient. These are not people who are very successful in cities. I mean, yes, Berlin is a CSD mayor, but first of all, CSD is not AfD. Second, as I said, Wagner was not running a homophobic campaign this year. He was running a Cars Are People Too campaign, and yeah, a lot of people were justifiably outraged that why is it okay that he's speaking at Pride at Christopher Street Day, but at the end of the day, he's trying to show his face. He's showing his face there, which again is not something that you would ever expect of a Merz, let alone an AfD politician. If an AfD person shows up to Pride, literally run away, this person is likely trying to commit a terrorist attack. And again, all of this matters because so part of it is the urbanization of queers is it's partly a matter of threat, partly a matter of often lack of parental support network. So you kind of have to be a producer and to like actually work for yourself and earn money because you don't necessarily have a parental support network. So I'm going to call it more proletarization of queers, but I'm not going to call it proletarization when it's not at all about working retail to the point that Amazon. I mean, there was this meme that at one point in Amazon the what is it called, the striped thigh-high socks that are so popular with trans women somehow got recommended together with intro to programming books because of how many trans women were working in tech. So again, this is something that you do in cities. Not the tech way, but the place where you go when you need to earn money because your parents are not going to, because your parents either did or you worry might cut you off. The one actual consumption thing is dating networks, because even if you're bi, you're not actually. I mean, there's this joke that bi people can have twice the fun. That's generally bullshit. Because a bi man generally does not actually have access to every bi or gay man or every bi or straight woman. That is ridiculous. So it's, even for bi people, it's very restricted networks, and so take the size of the city, cut it by a factor of 10. That's your dating network. So to the point of like dating in New York while queer is like dating in a what's an example of a city 1/10 the size of New York? Indianapolis. Like dating in Indianapolis while straight. I'm sure you can do it, but I mean, it's Indianapolis. Dating in Berlin while queer is like, what's a good? I don't even think that they have metro areas down to the size of Berlin divided by 10. It's like like maybe what? Yeah, because they're usually not. I mean, Berlin is 6 million if you count all of Brandenburg. So you cut that by a factor, and yeah, I mean, Berlin is queerer than the rest of Germany, so it's a little bit more than that, but still, the number of queer people in and around Berlin is probably, I don't know, 700,000, if that. I mean, I'm assuming 10% because I'm assuming that all of these numbers are suppressed due to a lot of closet cases, and the actual number is 10% and not 4%. If it's 4%, it's even more lopsided. So yeah, I mean, if it's and I guess also generational, the numbers are higher for people younger than me than for people older than me, and so yeah, if it's 700,000, again, it's barely even definable as a metro area at that point. And maybe Bremen, yeah, no, part of Bremen, yeah, and all of that matters. Freiburg or something. Ingolstadt. So that's the so often you're gonna have a representation of queers in cities. And yeah, again, as I said, some of it is existential, but not all of it. And so and again, it might decrease as if the gradient of acceptance decreases, and so we're saying actual decreases in the queer population of San Francisco and Seattle. Now, so 8% goes to 6.5%. I'm assuming this is not people being pushed out by gentrification, because this is not a low-income group. This is mostly just people, I imagine, who don't need to be in San Francisco or Portland, or for that matter, Austin. Not that in Austin the numbers are up because the city's growing very fast, but the percentage is flat. Also, Orlando is down. I can't tell whether it's because it's 2021 and Florida is a lot worse than it was. I want to say 5 years ago, but I guess the decline was earlier than that. So I don't know the pattern in Orlando or in Tampa, which is the same thing, like a dip and like kind of a V. But yeah, so the gradient might decrease, but the gradient's going to still be there. And so a lot of what you're thinking of is like building better cities. It's something that I was going to say it's mostly going to benefit queer people, because queer people at the end of the day, I think again, it's like queer identity is advancing. So I think in the United States for Zoomers, it's maybe 15% even, or 20-ish. But it's still 20% of the population. And it's 1%, yeah, it has some overrepresentation in places, but it's never going to be majority queer, even close to it. I mean, yeah, I imagine for, I don't know, New York queer Zoomers or something, it might hit 25%, but it's still 25%. But it is something that you need to be aware of, especially the issue of existential politics. Something that is very different from most civil rights oriented issues, other than I guess maybe for Jews, Jewish politics tend to be very existential. But usually you don't think about Jewish urbanism outside Israel and two New York enclaves. Whereas queers exist as like a notable minority in a lot of places. So anyway, I want to talk about this because, as I said, it's Pride today. I did go, I didn't stay very long. And if people have questions about this, and please don't ask about high speed 2 right now. Then yeah, if people have questions, I'll be happy to answer. What's the lag? Getting worse. Looks like 15 seconds. Okay. Sure, no problem. Gonna do a last call for questions, and then might actually be an hour or 5 stream. Or an hour or 5 recording, rather. But if you're watching the recording, you know how long it is. Okay, if not, then we can break. Thank you all for watching. And remember not to vote for homophobes, even if they tell you that like they are going to end like the oppression of being in boring meetings or whatever they think passes for oppression. That's never gonna help. And yeah, so I don't know when I'm gonna do my next stream. Probably gonna skip for at least another week, like week and a half. But yeah, thank you. I will see you, I don't know, hopefully in a week and a half or 2 weeks. And